coming to you from the city of the weird. Exploring topics from the esoteric and unexplored to dimensions unknown. Shining a light of truth on the darkest corners of our reality. Welcome to the Curious Realm.
Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to the Curious Realm's continuing coverage of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship Conference here in Denver, Colorado. We have the great pleasure of being joined by Cheryl Eagan-Donovan. She is from Controversy Films and the creator of Nothing Truer Than Truth on Amazon. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much.
How did you first come to light with the Shakespeare authorship controversy, Cheryl?
Well, I was a British literature major in high school, and then I did independent study on Shakespeare and androgyny when I was an undergrad in college, and then I took a history course at Harvard University with a professor named Don Ostrowski, who still teaches there, and his whole approach to history was about evidence, primary, tertiary, secondary evidence, and how do we know what we know. And so he asked us to write an essay, and he said one of the topics you might want to write about in that context is who wrote Shakespeare. And here I had been studying this for many years and had never heard that there was any kind of, controversy. Yeah. So he recommended John Thomas Loney's book, Shakespeare Identified. Mm-hmm. I read that. Then I read Joseph Sobrand's book, Alias Shakespeare. And I said, wow, this guy is so interesting. I was convinced, particularly with the analysis of the poetry that Loney did, because I had written poetry as an undergrad. It was clear to me that this was the developing voice of the poet who would become Shakespeare. So I went from there. I did a little research. I said, this guy is fascinating. I would love to make a film about him. I had just finished my first film, which was about music. It's called All Kinds of Girls. It was about a punk rock band from Boston. Yep. And I found out that Margot Anderson and Roger Strittmatter were working on a biography of Edward de Vere. Roger was still doing his PhD at UMass at the time, and then they ended up splitting up, and Margot finished the book, Shakespeare Identified, and Roger went on to do his PhD analysis of the Geneva Bible that's at the Folger Library. Yeah. So I went to the book release party and introduced myself to Margot Anderson and said I'd like to option the book. And then I went to the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship Conference in Ashland, Oregon, and had lunch with Margot, and we made a deal. So from there, I got the rights to the book, and that was great. Yeah. And from there, I started filming, and it was a long process, but I really enjoyed it. I loved it.
And at any point during that process, at what point did you come to the point? Have you come to a point of doubt about Shakespeare yourself through the process of making this film?
Well, as I said, when I was introduced to Edward de Vere, I was convinced that he was the author. So I started from that premise, but I wanted in my film to allow people to kind of get there on their own. So what I did was, show the parallels between the plays and his life, just as Margot Anderson had done. So I really used that book as a template, and I just focused on 2 chapters, really, that focus on the time that he went to Italy. So showing, using film clips, which again was an expensive way to show, the connections. But I felt that was something that young people could relate to. Like many of them are familiar, with Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet and also Zeffirelli's Romeo and Juliet. So we used the film clips to tell the story of the parallels between de Vere's life and the plays. And then we did a Kickstarter campaign. We went to Venice and northern Italy and filmed for 7 days, and that was really great. So that became the story arc. He leaves London and goes to Italy and, discovers Commedia dell'arte, meets Titian, sees the plays in Siena of Piccolomini, and he comes back with all these ideas about music and theater. And when the film ends with him returning to London, and then the first two plays that were produced right after he got back, comedy History of Errors, which we believe is an early comedy of errors, and then Titus and Giuseppus, which is an early version of Two Gentlemen of Verona. So that's where I left off with the first film.
Fantastic. And, that is one of the topics that we talk about regularly on the show, is the fact that whether it's Edward de Vere, whether it's anybody else, it's the fact that the author would have had to have traveled. He could not have been somebody of just regular common upbringing, common ilk. You would have had to have been somebody of means to have been able to have that worldly kind of travel, because the locations in Romeo and Juliet, the locations in, Merchant of Venice, things like that, they are actual locations.
Exactly. Yes, that was what was so fun. I was able to interview Richard Rowe before he passed, who wrote the book Shakespeare in Italy, who had gone to all of these locations and photographed them and wrote a beautiful book about that. But, other wealthy, as you said, aristocrats did travel to Italy. And so, for example, there was a book that came out a few years ago about Thomas North. He traveled in Italy. Someone talked at the conference today about Philip Sidney having gone to Venice. So other people did go to Venice. But the things that de Vere puts into the plays as Shakespeare are so specific. They're during the time period that he was there. And it's certainly not the kind of information that someone would get at the Merchant, at the Mermaid Tavern. And it's also, people sometimes say, well, he learned all of this from John Florio, but it's much more detailed than that.
Yeah. Yeah. And even the ideas of Romeo and Juliet, where they met, things like that, the way that the families operated, you would have had to have had an intimate knowledge of such things.
Right. And I mean, the great thing about Shakespeare is that he uses so many different sources and his own life experience. So as a writer, that's what I find fascinating, the way that he can take these archetypal characters and these great classic works, because Romeo and Juliet, for example, is based on a myth of, a real pair of lovers in 13th century, I guess it would be Verona, that tragically had this same thing happen to them. Yeah. And then, of course, there's the early poem of Arthur Brooke, Romeo and Juliet. But he also puts in his own experience, and that's what makes it so rich, because, for example, his men were fighting in the street with Anne Vavasor's family, her brother and her people. So it seems so closely related to, again, things that happened in his own life, not just other sources. So.
What were some of the other things that you came across that I guess kind of changed the lens through which you view Shakespeare as you created this film?
Well, I think one of the things that really interested me was what Loney just identified as his conflicted attitude toward women, and which Soberm writes about extensively about the sonnets, and the fact that it appears that the author was bisexual. And many, many Stratfordians have said that. And I found that was a really important part of the way he creates his characters, the strong women that he gives us, as I said, the androgyny that I was interested in when I was in college, writing about that. But I did find a lot of resistance to that theory. And so that was surprising. So one of the things that opened my eyes was that, that experience of getting some pushback on that.
Well, and, it's fascinating. I can see where you might get some pushback on that from people. But when you start looking at older societies, when you start looking specifically in royal courts, things like that, it was not an uncommon thing for a man to have a young lover. Things like that. I'm not saying it's okay by any means. Believe me, audience. But I can hear my audience
going
now.
Going back to Plato's time, it was perfectly acceptable.
Exactly.
So it depends how far you go back.
And that's just it. It isn't until our modern time, really closer to the Victorian era, things like that. I mean, even that was one of the things that John Adams got on Benjamin Franklin about, was like, my God, you're torrid when you're over there in France. And Benjamin Franklin was like, I don't think you understand how French politics works. If I'm not betting these women and doing these things, we aren't going to get anywhere, because that's how French society works.
Well, that's a great analogy to when de Vere went to Venice. So when he went to Venice, I did some research about what was going on there, and it was really kind of the last frontier. It was anything goes kind of place. It still is a little bit. And so, not only the dressing up for carnival, which allowed you to mix with the different
That's
classes
right.
because
That's
you're
right.
in disguise, but people actually played the roles. And, the female prostitutes dressed as men because that
Yep.
way they could get the male clients who were looking for someone. So it's really fascinating when you look into the time period that he was there. He did... he was known to a famous courtesana, Virginia Padawana. And so when you find out, about his experience when he was there, it's really fascinating. And I think it would have been something he was interested in, and it certainly informed his work.
Now, during the creation of this, how long did it take you to research the film before you started filming?
Well, altogether, it took me about 10 years to finish the film, but I was doing research as I went. So I think, I'm making a new film now, and I'm trying to finish filming this year because I'd like to, get it out
back to back.
Right, get it out next year, have it ready in time
On the
for festival
coattails.
deadlines. Yeah, and so I've been doing research, though, since the last film was released, and I've been going to the libraries and archives in London and the UK and doing my own research on. In this film, what I'm interested in looking at is his theatrical career. So Edward de Vere as the center of the theatrical world in late 16th century London. A lot of my work and my inspiration for doing this research and making this new film came from Alexander Waugh, who's a brilliant researcher in the UK who helped me a lot with this. But he has a theory, that de Vere was at the center of the world at that time. The theater world had a whole group of writers working for him. And by the end of the 1580s, the early 1590s, when coincidentally, the name Shakespeare first appears, he's gone broke. And at that point, the other actors and businessmen, Allen, Henslow, and Burbage take over the theater scene. So I said, I love that story arc, and I want to, do more research on that. So I've been looking at all the manuscripts that support that theory. And then I wanted to tell the story of Edward de Vere's development as a playwright and theater maker, and the parallel story of the development of Elizabethan theater in London and at the universities. So that's what we've been filming for the last year.
Wow. And what kind of release date are you looking at right now?
Well, like I said, it probably 2026, because if we can, we have to finish filming for the most part, unless we do a little pickup or something, and then editing, and then get it in time for festival deadlines next year.
All right. So. Two-part question. How has your film been received by this community, by the Oxfordian community, and how has it been received by the standard theater community, the fans of who we know as Shakespeare, the man from Avon?
Well, this community, the Oxfordian and the authorship community, has been completely supportive, totally supportive, and I could not have done either film without their help and support. So many of the great scholars that are here appeared in the film, and so many other people helped, by contributing to fundraising and giving me access to things. I found my composer through someone who's here.
Wow.
It's all about connections. My distributor was through someone who was introduced to me by an Oxfordian in Washington, D.C. So I tell people all the time, the connections that you make with people are so important. That's how you get to releasing the film.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But in the general audience, the film is doing really well. When I premiered in Harvard Square at the Brattle Theater in Cambridge in 2018, we had a great response. People really loved it. People who had never even heard of the question. And as I said, I think the fact that it's still doing very well online indicates that there's a lot of interest.
And no kickback from the English studies communities or the theater communities?
What's interesting is that many people have participated in the film whose jobs would preclude them from doing so. So they were very kind of cautious and said, I'd love to talk to you about Shakespeare. I know what your film is about, but just don't ask me to make that connection. Like, don't ask me to say that Oxford was Shakespeare. So as a result of that, it was wonderful. I got to interview Diane Paulus, who's the director of the American Repertory Theater.
Wow.
She's fantastic. I love her. She's a really great expert on Shakespeare herself and a great, theater director. She's just terrific. And then Tina Packer, who is the founder of Shakespeare and Company in Lenox, Mass. And she was wonderful. I mean, she's just such a great speaker. And she talked about what we were talking about earlier about men and relationships in London. She said, well, I just think, Shakespeare went to bed with whoever was to hand. And then she laughs at her very hearty laugh, So it was great. And she talked about Shakespeare's women. So all of those things were wonderful to have. A few Stratfordians, a few I asked would not do it. Stephen Greenblatt just said no to me again the other day.
It can be hard to get some of them on screen to talk.
But he always has a great excuse that he has a new book coming out. He's a very prolific writer. And, I've talked to him a lot about it.
And the reason I asked that is because, I come from a theater background, and one of my favorite things is whenever I release episodes about this, I'll always hear from one friend from college that was in theater, like, really, Chris? And I find it interesting that those that you did interview that were from the theater community were like, yeah, I will talk about this, but I will not say that this person was the author of Shakespeare, because, it's a big thing in the theater. I think much more in the theater community than in the actual English studies community. I think quite a few people in the English studies community might be interested in the concept, may even be interested in the forensic deep dive.
Analysis,
but I think it's more the theater community that is really guarded with it.
Well, there's a standard response is it doesn't matter, we have the plays.
Yes,
but then I have to give credit to two people who have been super supportive for this new film and of the last film, and that's Sir Derek Jacobi and Richard Clifford, who's a great actor and director, and they have been terrific, and they talk about the fact that it doesn't change the way you perform the works, but it's fascinating. So, for example, Sir Derek studied history. He's fascinated by the history,
It gives you a different route of the work. When you have that different route, when you know that this joke that's happening isn't just a joke, it's an inside joke. That this is an inside joke between these three families in the royal situation. This duke's family, that person's family, and this person's family, and they all have this infighting. And unless you were involved in the business of the royal families, you would not have known that. The common person may have chuckled, because the situation on stage, but they wouldn't have known the deeper meaning of that. Knowing that deeper meaning of that gives you a different way to deliver the performance.
Right, and I think it goes back to, a couple other things that Derek talks about in my first film, and that's, the fact that the plays were first performed at court for an insider audience who didn't know what the references were. Only later were they then performed at the Globe, for example. And the other thing that I love that, Derek's been really great about being very open about is that, he thinks clearly the sonnets are love poems, and that, that indication is that the author was bisexual. So, he made no bones about that, was very clear about that.
Talking to the other side of his sexuality, basically.
Right, but the academic community does push back on that, unfortunately. They say, they say, well, actors don't, what do actors know? Well, I think actors know a lot, so it's a little hypocritical that they say that.
Well, as a creator yourself, why do you think it's important that we find out, Cheryl?
That's a great question, because that's how I started my first film. As a writer, I think it's essential because I teach writing and I've been writing for many years. We do write from our own experience, absolutely. We have to be discreet and we combine lots of people to make characters, but we also have to have access to books, and the access to the source material, it's just not there for the guy from Stratford. It doesn't exist. No. He did not have access to the books.
He couldn't have read them.
Many of the books in the original languages.
That's right.
And
that's right.
Lastly, it's about revision. It's revision, revision, revision. A great writer, doesn't just spring full born from the head like Athena. So it takes a lot of work. Genius takes, they say 10,000 hours. So those three things I think are important for students of writing. And as an educator, that's an important reason for me.
It is. And, that's something that you really have to consider. Like I was just talking a minute ago with Roger, our last guest. I've got volumes of poetry that I've written, and it's interesting to look back at the beginning and then go back to the last thing I wrote, probably 10 years ago almost now, and see that progression myself as an artist, see that progression within myself as far as point of view. Good God, I wish I could have ever written outside of a first-person point of view. That's even musically, it's something that I could never do. I could never step into somebody else's shoes and write another character. It's not how my brain thinks.
Right.
And I laud anybody who can.
That's a great point, too, because I did speak at one of the conferences about that. So with other poets, we do have their early work, and we can see their growth. Sylvia Plath started writing very young. One of her early poems
Prime example.
Not very good. Her later stuff is fantastic.
Yeah.
And I also love the story of Arthur Rimbaud, who was so prolific in such a short amount of time, But there are lots of analogies. But the other reason that it's important to me does have to do with the way that he represents gender and sexuality and, respect for everyone. He's very much aware of the other and differences. And I really think, I developed a separate curriculum called Shakespeare for Bullies that addresses, that using the plays.
Interesting.
I really think it's important to understand, that Shakespeare isn't just some old white guy.
No.
He was somebody who was, really ahead of his time.
Even when you get into Othello.
Yes.
Right now, Denzel Washington is getting ready to, and I cannot wait for that to come out. It's going to be so incredible.
Right? Yeah, that's going to be great.
But to see modern interpretations of that, and even see how that situation was treated in Elizabethan times, is a very distinct window into that royal culture, into that background of culture that existed in a strata above everyday society.
Right, but I do think, as I said, Shakespeare is unique in that he really took advantage of the origins and the basic premise of theater, which is disruption and misrule and turning those roles upside down around. That's what the theater allows for. So it allows for to play different genders and to play different class people. So I think he just really embraced that, and that's what makes him unique.
Yeah. Now, with films like yours out there now, and with the new one coming out, how do we broach this topic to new generations? How do we, I guess, other than shows like this and things like that, how do we get this word out there? How do we begin to open the dialogue, Cheryl?
Well, I do think that through the media, there are people doing, Alexander Waugh's videos are on YouTube, and Phoebe Neer's TikTok videos are really great, But again, as an educator, we find that students are very open to it. So I really think it's a matter of the next generation. They're interested. The high school teachers are really interested. Roger and Shelley and I went to a conference a few years ago, the National Council of Teachers of English Conference. We talked to thousands of junior high and high school teachers who were so excited about the authorship because it's a different way to approach telling Shakespeare.
Well, so. And it's not that I'm not a fan of Shakespeare, friends, but it's a much more interesting way to study Shakespeare.
Right, because the knee-jerk reaction a lot of times is like, oh, Shakespeare is so boring, I hate Shakespeare.
And it's
so
also
hard to read.
Where is the background? Where do you start? Like you start with a pseudo-history, you start with a little bit about the man from Avon, but once again, at that point we can broach the topic of, or is he?
Right.
And introduce that idea. So it's great that you are out there doing this with film because there's, as you know, as an educator, some of us learn with our hands, some with our ears, some with our eyes. And if you can engage more of those, so people like you doing film and making things like this engaging really do bring a beautiful new aspect of media to this hunt for the true authorship of Shakespeare. So
that's my hope.
Absolutely. Well, let everybody know where they can go to find out more about Controversy Films, where they can go to watch the movie, where they can go to see the trailer for the new one and keep up with everything that you're doing.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. They can go right to my website, which is www.controversyfilms.com. And there you can find links to the full-length film, which is still, as I said, on Amazon and a bunch of free streamers now. And then you'll find also the trailer for the new film, which is called All the World's a Stage.
Fantastic.
So, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for
really
the time on this, quite honestly, very busy Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship Conference. When I walked in, I do conference AV for a living, and when I walked in, you never know what to expect with a topic like this. It is fantastic to see such a full room of people that are so catalyzed by the conversation and so involved in the conversation and question asking. It's fantastic.
Right.
So thank you so much for coming
you.
and being here
Thanks
and
for
presenting.
joining us.
While you are online checking out everything from Cheryl at Controversy Films, make sure to stop on by Curious Realm. CuriousRealm.com is where you can follow, subscribe. It's where you can find all of our interviews with guests like Cheryl and others. Make sure to stay through this quick commercial break. We will be right back with our continuing coverage of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship Conference right here in Denver, Colorado, right after this, folks.
The key to good science is good research. At the heart of good research is a good data set. With the field observation and encounter log from Curious Research, you can easily keep track of your investigative information all in one place, making it easier to review cases and readily see comparisons and contrasts between them. Whether out in the woods squatching, in a back room gathering EVPs, or using high-tech gear to track UFO, UAP activity, this easy-to-carry, pocket-sized scientific data log is the perfect companion for any field researcher. You can find your copy of the Curious Research Field Observation and Encounter Log at Amazon.com or visit the official Curious Realm store at CuriousRealm.com/store to reserve your copy for yourself, your family, or a mind that you want to open. That website again is CuriousRealm.com/store.